Chapter 25, Acid-Base Balance, Screencast 1. There will be a total of 2 screencasts for this part of Chapter 25, and once again, these 2 screencasts will be focusing on acid-base balance. The first will be based on concepts of how we regulate acid-base balance, and the second screencast will primarily deal with acid-base imbalances. Now, when we talk about acid-base balance, really what we're addressing here is how does the body regulate pH? And it really is all about hydrogen ion concentration. Now, normal pH of our blood, please note blood pH, not urine pH, is 7.35 to 7.45. And notice that as the pH is above 7, blood is actually slightly alkaline. Now, please keep in mind you're not responsible for memorizing the values or normal ranges for blood pH. Now, proper pH balance is really important to our bodily functions, and probably one of the things it's most associated with is making sure that proteins are not denatured. Proteins can easily be natured by extreme pHs, either too high or too low. Now, the things that can actually alter hydrogen concentration within our body is the consumption or input of both acid and base, the output of both acid and base, and keep in mind this is regulated by the kidneys, our respiratory rate, and chemical buffers. Now, the important thing to remember here, and this is something that a lot of people really do struggle with, is that there is an inverse relationship between hydrogen ion concentration and pH. When pH is decreased, we actually see an increase in hydrogen ion concentration. An increase in pH is actually a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. So keep this in mind. When we add an acid, that increases hydrogen ion, whereas a base will reduce it. Now, there are 2 general types of acids within our body, and they're referred to generally as fixed and volatile. Now, when we talk about fixed acids, I tend to prefer using the term metabolic acid. So these fixed or metabolic acids, they are waste products that come from the metabolic processes that take place within our body. For example, phosphoric acid is from the metabolism of nucleic acids. Lactic acid is due to glycolysis, and keto acids originate from fat metabolism. The important thing to remember here is that the concentration of these fixed or metabolic acids are actually regulated by the kidney. Now, volatile acids, remember that carbonic acid is produced when carbon dioxide combines with water. This occurs on the red blood cells and is facilitated by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this equation because we covered this in detail in Chapter 23 when we talked about how CO2 is converted into bicarbonate ion, as that is the primary way in which it is transported within our plasma. In this screencast, we will address the role of bicarbonate as a plasma buffer. Now, the reason why it is referred to as a volatile acid is because it is produced from an expired or evaporated gas. This will be regulated by the respiratory system, primarily by the control of ventilation. Now, the first thing that we're going to focus on when it comes to the regulation of fixed acids is what are conditions that are going to increase hydrogen ion concentration. We have to look at major input into the blood, and generally that is coming from nutrients that are absorbed from the GI tract. Now, one thing to remember, in the United States, we eat a lot of animal protein and wheat, and so this results in more acid going into the GI tract. We can also think about nutrients that are coming from body cells. We've already talked about waste products that are coming from metabolic processes, and this is where lactic acid, phosphoric acid, and keto acids came into play. Another factor would be diarrhea. Now, the kidneys are going to respond to maintain normal pH. When hydrogen ion is increased, we will see the reabsorption of all filtered bicarbonate, and this occurs along the nephron, the synthesization and absorption of new bicarbonate, and the excretion of hydrogen ion into the filtrate. So remember, how the kidneys are going to handle hydrogen ion is based on the condition and what is happening to hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. So let's take a look at this diagram here, and I know we've addressed a number of these in the previous slide. And so what we're looking at is where hydrogen ion is coming from, and really one of the biggest sources is going to be from our diet. And many of the foods that we consume are acidic in nature. Now, we're also talking about the production of these acids due to cellular metabolism, and now examples would be lactic acid, phosphoric acid, and keto acid. Now, the other thing to remember here would be the loss of bicarbonate ion. Now, when we are looking at how the kidneys actually regulate hydrogen ion concentration, it happens within the intercalated cells. The first thing that we're looking at here is the type A cells. These are the cells that will come into play when blood becomes acidic. And if we look at what's happening, basically remember the processes of reabsorption and secretion. What we're seeing here is within the type A cells, we're going to see the reabsorption of bicarbonate into the blood, and that should make sense. We're talking about acidic condition, and we're going to be adding a buffer. The other thing that's happening is hydrogen ion will be moving in the opposite direction, and it's actually going to be secreted into the tubular fluid. Now, if we look at some conditions that are responsible for causing hydrogen ion concentration in our blood to decrease, this is not something we see very often. And once again, we're talking about metabolic conditions. One example would be the ingestion of antacids. Another, probably the most common, would be vomiting with the loss of hydrochloric acid and acidic stomach contents. Now, when we look at the response by the tubules within our kidney, they're not really reabsorbing all filtered bicarbonate along the length of the nephron tubule. They'll be secreting bicarbonate from blood into the filtrate and reabsorbing hydrogen ion in exchange for that bicarbonate. Now here, the kidneys are acting as a physiologic buffering system. What they are actually doing is eliminating excess acid or base. This is something that takes a long time to occur, but it really is the most powerful mechanism we have to maintain blood pH. Now here, let's take a look at the diagram. And so once again, we're looking at the input of base, and this could be from a vegetarian diet because if we look at fruits, vegetables, but also wheats and other plants and bases, they tend to be alkaline in nature, or we might actually consume antacids. This results in a decrease in hydrogen ion. Another potential would be vomiting. And remember, the acidic contents of our stomach are lost through this process. So now let's take a look what's happening within the kidneys themselves. Now we're looking at the type B intercalated cells. Remember, B for basic. So now we're actually going to be absorbing hydrogen ion. Remember, the issue here is we don't have enough hydrogen ion. And so those type B cells will release hydrogen ion into the blood to decrease or bring the pH back to normal. We will actually be secreting bicarbonate ion into the tubule so it can actually be excreted within the urine. Now, when we look at the regulation of pH via the respiratory system, it's all about carbonic acid. When the body is at rest, CO2 is normally eliminated from lungs at the same rate that it is produced. During exercise, CO2, hydrogen ion, and O2 levels will be detected by chemoreceptors. This is going to result in an alteration of ventilation. So one thing to keep in mind is what impacts ventilation more so than anything else is an increase in carbon dioxide. One thing to remember here is during exercise, we're really going to be increasing ventilation to meet the demand of the exercise. Now remember, the levels of carbonic acid within our body are directly related to how much CO2 we have. Now, remember, when we talk about CO2 and carbonic acid, they usually don't have daily fluctuations, and we generally don't see an impact in acid-base balance. Now, let's take a look at how ventilation has an impact on blood levels for CO2. So CO2 will diffuse from the blood within the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli and then expired. The expiration of CO2 by the respiratory system is normally equal to the production of CO2 by our cells, and blood CO2 remains within normal ranges. Remember, CO2 is produced by aerobic respiration within the mitochondria, and then it diffuses into the blood of the systemic capillaries. Remember the conversion of CO2 into bicarbonate ion occurring at the cellular level or the systemic level, and it was converted back to CO2 within the pulmonary capillaries. Now, the most effective system we have are chemical buffers, and they're very fast acting and actually can act in minutes to temporarily prevent pH changes. Now, generally, when we look at a chemical buffering system, they're made up of one or two types of molecules. One that can bind and release hydrogen ion within a fraction of a second. And the thing to remember here is this is composed of a weak base and a weak acid. The weak base can bind the excess hydrogen ion. The weak acid can release hydrogen ion. I generally put much more of an emphasis on acidosis, especially when we're looking at that hydrogen ion or acidosis is more common than alkalosis, and we can think of a buffer as a hydrogen ion sponge. And remember, a sponge has a limited capacity to absorb water, and it can be overwhelmed. Once a buffer is overwhelmed, we will see dramatic changes in pH as there is no more buffer to do its job. Now, what we have to remember here is buffers are temporary and limited until physiological buffering systems can actually eliminate the excess acid or base. The three major chemical buffering systems we have within our body are going to be protein, and they act to buffer our cells and also the blood. Phosphate is strictly a cellular buffer, and then bicarbonate is actually an extracellular buffer, especially within the blood. And remember, bicarbonate ion is the product of converting CO2 into bicarbonate so CO2 can be transported within our body. So it does double duty. So not only are we transporting CO2 in this manner, it also acts as a very potent buffer within our blood. Now, if we look at our protein buffering system, and we find proteins once again within the cells and the plasma, it accounts for 75% of chemical buffering within our bodily fluids. We have intracellular proteins, plasma proteins, and hemoglobin, and they all help minimize pH changes throughout the body. And if we go back to proteins, and basically the building block is an amino acid. The amine group, where the nitrogen is, acts as a weak base to buffer acid, whereas the carboxyl group is a weak acid and actually buffers base. When we look at phosphate, this is primarily found within the intracellular fluid, and it is very effective in buffering metabolic acids that are produced by the cells. It is composed of a weak base and a weak acid. The weak base, hydrogen phosphate, whereas the weak acid is dihydrogen phosphate. Overall, strong acid is buffered to produce weak acid, and strong base is buffered to produce a weak base. Now, bicarbonate, this is what we've addressed previously. It is the most important buffering system within the extracellular fluid, and we're talking about a weak base and weak acid. The weak base is bicarbonate, and the weak acid is carbonic acid. The net result is strong acid buffered to produce weak acid, whereas strong base is buffered to produce a weak base. Now, remember, buffering capacity, it's a limitation in the amount of acid or base that a chemical buffering system can actually accomplish or buffer. Remember that they can be overwhelmed, and when they are overwhelmed, we'll see dramatic changes in pH.